one frame that one might use to explain what's happening is something like, the singularity is happening, it's just unevenly distributed. That what we're seeing as culture war is actually just the specific response of structures, psychological structures, political structures, in the context of kind of a warping or a shaping. It's almost like a tornado, a vortex of change that is happening differentially. So it's happening in different places at different rates. So for example, one of the reasons why like the West Coast of the US, or the big cities, happen to be hot spots of these super intense culture war type forces is in fact actually because that's where the effect of the singularity is at its most advanced. Like that's where it's happening the most.
Are you using singularity in the Kurzweilian sense?
I'm using it in the sense of this particular Russian theorist. So it has to do with something like an accelerating rate of change in the paradigmatic sense. Deep change, and deep change now happening at a rate that is inside our psychological capacity to respond. So by the time we've actually begun to recohere some kind of paradigm, the paradigm itself has actually shifted. The invention of paradigmatic mind, a particular mind that had a capacity to generate models, largely in the propositional layer, to coordinate behavior across large populations by using these models, and then mechanisms for disseminating it and holding the models as having a certain level of ideological integrity, formal meaning structures. And then a time frame, a period of time where the paradigms would S-curve, right? They would begin the process of formation, they would actually become relatively effective, they would manifest as emergent practical capacities in reality, which would show up in terms of economy and military and things like that, which would then lead to expansive civilizations. Then they would reach the nadir of the paradigm's own efficacy, the anomaly. I'm doing kind of Tainter and Kuhn at the same time.
Yeah, I get it.
Anomalies would start getting thrown, you would start getting decreasing returns on complicatedness, etc. And then you would have some kind of a collapse, both at the level of psychology, meaning our meaning-making structures are becoming ineffective, and at the level of economy and military, and then you would have some new paradigm emerge. And singularity hypothesis proposes that this is actually something which is happening more rapidly. So you go like 1,000 years and then 500 years and now 250. I'm just using habit. That's not the actual curve. And the point is that if you think about the developmental capacity of Homo sapiens, right, it's very much embedded in generational cycles, meaning that 8-year-olds can develop a paradigm much more rapidly than 80-year-olds, or can adapt to a new paradigm more rapidly. So there's like a rate limiter of, as long as the rate of change of paradigms is happening outside of that rate, the boomers, you remember the generation gap?
Yeah.
The boomers are literally developmentally responding to a completely different paradigm than their parents. So it was that their parents, were developmentally in paradigm 8, and boomers were actually developmentally in paradigm 9, because the paradigm had shifted inside that arc within that 50-year period. But the boomers were, in fact, in some sense, well adapted to the paradigm in which they were in. The paradigm itself, suffers from Tainter and Kuhnian problems, but the boomers are well adapted to it. But by the time you start getting into the 70s, what happens is that inside a developmental arc, like the generation X is characterized by kind of like having a half step. So the mid-century paradigm was already broken by the time that we were coming of age, but a new paradigm hadn't yet shifted, so we were caught. But then with the millennials, again, in this theory, what happens to the millennials is, as they show up in a paradigm, they develop into a paradigm. By the time they're 14, that paradigm is already collapsing. And by the time they're 28, the next paradigm is already collapsing. So now, inside the psychological developmental space of a single human life, if you start getting paradigm shifts happening at that rate, that's a completely different game.